Welcome to this deep dive. Today, we're stepping back over a century, actually.
We are. We're looking into this incredible historical account, an ethnographic survey from southern India, published way back in 1909.
Specifically, Volume 7, which covers castes and tribes whose names start with T through Z.
And this isn't just, some dry old book. It was compiled by the government press in Madras, and it's like a window. It gives this really granular look at the social fabric.
Daily lives, customs, jobs, all sorts of things for a huge range of communities in southern India at that exact time.
Exactly. So our mission here is to sift through this pretty dense text and pull out the most fascinating details, the surprising facts, the key insights.
Right. How people lived, worked, worshipped, how their societies were structured. And we're sticking only to what this volume told us.
Think of it like getting a high-resolution snapshot, but from over 100 years ago. A really complex world.
We're going to see intricate social roles, unique customs, maybe some unexpected rituals.
And how identity was all tied up with community, family, and what you did for a living. It's definitely more than just a list of names.
Okay, let's unpack this source. Let's see what kind of world it opens up for us, starting with maybe some fundamental roles and occupations.
Sounds good. The text gives us a lot of detail on specific roles. Take the Taliyari, for instance.
The Taliyari.
Okay.
Okay, what was that?
Described as the village watchman, or sometimes the chief watchman. And get this, one name for them was Udari.
Udari.
Which means savior of the village.
Wow, savior of the village. That really tells you something about how important the role was, doesn't it?
Absolutely. It wasn't just a minor job. Their duties were crucial for local order, for security.
Like, what specifically? What did they do?
Well, the source lists things like tracking stolen cattle, which must have been vital, guarding the village, lock up the coultry.
The courtry, right? Like a public hall or holding place.
Exactly. Attending the village head during minor trials, serving official documents, even distraining goods, seizing them if necessary.
So a mix of policing, security, and sort of administrative functions.
Pretty much. And the account notes it wasn't the same everywhere. In bigger villages, it says, one Talayari might be a Parian, looking after the pariah quarter specifically.
Ah, interesting. So it adapted to the local social structure.
Right. And it also mentions that in the Telugu country, Mutrakas were called Talarivalu. And over in Kurnool and Bellary, Bidars held the same role, but they were called Talarivandlu.
So the name and who filled the role could change depending on the region and the dominant communities there.
Precisely. It shows how these essential roles were integrated into the existing caste system in different places.
Okay. And beyond these sort of general watchmen, the source talks about roles tied to specific trades, too.
Oh, definitely. It mentions the Tachakurup.
Tachakurup.
They're noted specifically as barbers, but for the Kamelans, who were artisans.
Okay. And Tachan. That sounds similar.
Tachan is listed as the carpenter subdivision within the Kamelans, so specialization within a broader group.
Got it. And other occupation-based names.
Yes, like Telicula or Teli. That points directly to the oil presser's caste. The name itself apparently comes from telo, meaning oil.
And it even breaks them down further.
It does. It mentions sections like Holodia and Belodia within the oil pressers.
Okay. And then Tagalis.
Described mainly as kitchen and market gardeners, known especially for growing betel leaves.
Right. Moving on from those roles, the source pays quite a bit of attention to the Tiyans and the Vestalines.
Yes, it does. It identifies them as the major toddy drawing castes, found mostly in Malabar, Cochin, and Travancore.
Toddy drawing.
Yeah.
So tapping palm trees for the sap, which could be fermented.
Exactly. And the source even gives the 1909 census figures for them, showing they were pretty large populations.
What's interesting is that the text also touches on their origins, doesn't it? It mentions a possible link.
It does. It brings up the idea of a shared ancestry with the Shinars of Ceylon, Sri Lanka now, of course. The name Tiyan, or Ishuvan, might even come from older names for the island, like Isadwipa or Simhaladwipa.
So it connects these occupation groups to potentially quite ancient migrations. Fascinating.
It is. The volume also describes another really interesting role, seemingly quite powerful, the Tandon.
The Tandon, what was their function?
Characterized as the principal person in the decision of caste disputes.
Whoa. That sounds like a huge amount of social authority.
Yeah.
What kind of responsibilities did that involve?
Well, their presence, their assistance, was apparently required at really crucial life ceremonies. We're talking Talatying, puberty rituals, marriages, even during pregnancy.
Mandatory attendance?
Seems like it. The source is very specific. It says a carpenter couldn't even cut down an areca palm to build a marriage shed without getting the Tandons' formal permission first.
Incredible. And they were involved in divorce cases, too.
Yes, held important functions there as well.
And it wasn't just a village-level thing. The source connects them higher up.
Right. It connects them to the Zamarin, the local ruler, and other Rajas. And it mentions they were required to have a bodyguard of Nayars.
A bodyguard. That tells you something about how central and maybe how risky that role of settling disputes could be.
Definitely suggests a certain status and perhaps vulnerability.
Okay, one more occupation group from this section, the Vallambans.
Ah, yes, the Vallans. A Telugu caste of sea fishermen found along the Ganjam and Vizagapatam coast.
And their social standing.
The document notes their position is considered low, but it does say they interdine and intermarry with another group, the Palis.
And it gives a detail about how they fished.
Yes, a very specific image. Using baskets to catch crabs in shallow, brackish water.
Yeah.
Little details like that really bring it to life. It's remarkable, isn't it? Just these brief descriptions, village watchman, oil presser, dispute settler, fisherman. They immediately start building this picture of a world where your job was so deeply tied into everything else. Caste, social rank, local administration.
Absolutely. And speaking of how things were tied together, this is where the source gets really interesting, I think, when it delves into the customs and rituals.
Oh, definitely. Let's talk about the Tali Ketu Kalyanam, often called the tally-tying marriage, especially as described for groups like the Tiyans we just mentioned.
Right. What's striking, even in this 1909 account, is that people didn't seem to agree on what it actually meant.
Exactly. The source lays out differing viewpoints from the time. Some people saw it as a real marriage, conferring rights to live together. But the source says a large majority apparently viewed it as more of a fictitious marriage. They weren't even sure where it came from.
And there was a third view.
Yes, another interpretation presented it as an essential caste observance, sort of a preliminary step, something you had to do before any actual sexual relations could happen within a sanctioned relationship later on.
So really complex.
Yeah.
And the text puts this in context.
It does. It links it to families that followed Maramakatayam.
That's the system of inheritance through the female line, right?
Yeah.
Property passed down through the women.
Exactly. It notes Brahmins were often involved in these ceremonies too, and the source contrasts this whole practice with what developed later, especially in North Malabar, the Sambandam contract under the Putamuri form. That was seen as a more formal contractual union.
So even within one custom described over a century ago, you had evolution, regional variation, different interpretations all happening at once.
Absolutely. And the source highlights more regional differences just within Malabar itself, comparing North and South marriage customs.
What were the key differences mentioned?
Well, in the North, you had that female line inheritance. The wife usually stayed living in her own family home, her tarwood. And dowry wasn't really a fixed thing, more like customary gifts.
Oh, yeah, in the South.
In South Malabar, the account describes male line inheritance. The wife moved to her husband's house, and dowry money, jewels, furniture was usually settled beforehand.
But across both regions, the astrologer was key.
Yes, the Panikar. Consistently vital. Examining horoscopes for compatibility before any marriage could go ahead. Seems that was non-negotiable.
Right, no. The Tottiyan marriage customs. The source describes these as being particularly distinct.
They really are. Some details are quite remarkable.
Like the fact that the husband doesn't tie the botu, the marriage badge.
Yeah.
That's usually such a central part of South Indian weddings.
It is. But this account states very clearly there's no such tying around the bride's neck as the binding part of their ceremony.
So what happens instead?
Instead, the ritual involves building 2 temporary huts outside the village. Inside these, they worship ancestral heroes, represented by folded cloths.
Okay.
And there are specific trees used for the structure Pungu, Mimusaps hexandra, and interestingly, Strychnos noxvomica, the source of strychnine.
Wow. And then the text mentions liberal potations.
Yes, liberal consumption of toddy is explicitly noted as part of the ceremony.
Okay, the ritual itself sounds unique. But the source includes something else about Tottiyans marriage practices that's, well, frankly astonishing.
Yes. It reports that newly married girls could potentially be compelled, that's the word used, to cohabit with the husband's near relatives, his brothers, or close male kin.
Compelled, why?
The source states it was believed that refusing this custom would bring ill luck to the family or community. It even reports that priests sometimes had to compel the custom if the family neglected it.
That's a very difficult custom to understand from a modern perspective. The source seems to be documenting a form of marriage obligation that went far beyond the couple.
It certainly seems that way. Prioritizing the extended family, maybe appeasing ancestors. It's presented as a really distinctive social contract in this account.
And there's a related point about adultery.
Yes. The source notes a striking consequence within their community, as reported at the time. Adultery within that family circle was apparently not considered a crime.
But outside it.
But any liaison with an outsider led to expulsion from the caste. It defined the boundaries of acceptable relationships very, very differently.
Shifting focus now. From marriage to death rituals, the Todas second funeral gets a lot of detailed description.
Yes, the Bara Kedu, or dry funeral, as the Badagas apparently called it. The source describes it with incredible specificity.
What were the key elements?
Well, first, a distinct separation. Men gathered in one area, women and children in another. Then there's this weeping ritual.
How did that work?
Mourners would place their heads together, sort of forehead to forehead, and also salute each other's feet. A very physical expression of grief.
And then came the buffalo sacrifice.
Yes. The account details the buffalo being dragged in, killed with an axe blow to the back of the neck.
And a particularly poignant detail.
Placing the corpse's feet, or if it was a man who died, his hand at the mouth of the sacrificed buffalo during the ritual.
And the bell from the buffalo.
That was removed by members of the Koda tribe. And the source also notes dancing took place after the buffalo was killed.
The volume includes a little story related to this too, doesn't it?
It does. An anecdote about a strong young man who failed to lift the dead buffalo, leading to elders muttering about the degeneration of the youth compared to their day.
Huh. Some things never change, maybe. Those little details really ground the historical account.
They really do. Okay, so beyond these life cycle events, the source looks at religious practices specific to different groups. Sakti worship among the Tiyans, for instance.
Which was noted as their exclusive privilege.
Yes. And interestingly, this worship often involved liquor, specifically arak made from palms, directly linking their religious practice to their main job as toddy drawers.
So the substance they produced was central to their worship.
Seems so. The source mentions a secrecy oath associated with it and says Bhagavati is seen as a guardian spirit. There's even a quote in the text. The highest merit in Sakti can be reached only through arak.
Wow. And other Tiyan practices.
They also worship jungle gods, sometimes lighting lamps for 40 days straight, and made pilgrimages like to a place called Kotior.
And the Velans, the fishermen we mentioned earlier, they had their own distinct practices.
Yes, the source describes their family shrines. These contained figures not just of gods, but also of deceased relatives. Ancestor veneration.
Any specific deities mentioned?
Kalimakama, worshipped as a stone with offerings of pigs, and Padama or Palama, represented by a wooden effigy, who received offerings of goats, sheep, and milk.
And a key figure was the Manaru.
Right. He acts as both priest and diviner. The source says people consulted him for things like bad luck with fishing.
And he had a divination method.
Using a stone tied to a string, apparently.
Okay. Then we have the Velans and Vannans, described rather broadly.
Yes, as devil dancers, sorcerers, and quack doctors. But a key service they provided was giving matu.
Matu, that's the ritually clean washed cloth, right? Used to remove pollution for various castes.
Exactly. And here's a fascinating social dynamic. The text notes the Vannans would deliberately refuse to give this matu service to the Kamalans.
Why would they do that?
As a way of claiming a higher social status over them. It shows how even a seemingly simple ritual service could become a tool in social power plays.
Interesting. And the sorcery mentioned. It wasn't vague, was it?
Not at all. The source lists specific mantras they supposedly used. Things like causing delays in menstruation or drying up a cow's milk.
Or even trying to achieve a tiger disguise.
Yes, using tiger whiskers and silk, apparently. There's also a description of a house-burning ritual using a crow's nest and ashes from a cremation ground. The account really doesn't shy away from the more unusual or, frankly, unsettling practices reported at the time.
No, it doesn't. Another ritual figure mentioned is the Velchipad.
Right. Described as a temple servant and oracle. Someone who enters a trance, speaks supposedly as a deity, and performs self-laceration, cutting themselves reportedly for a fee.
Wow. The source also touches briefly on some other rituals.
A few, yeah. Tulaparam, that's the practice of weighing someone in scales against valuable goods like gold or pepper, usually for charity or fulfilling a vow.
And housewarming ceremonies.
Quite detailed. A carpenter performs the puja, offers things like toddy, arak, and a fowl sacrifice to appease a spirit called Gulikin. Then the workmen walk around the new house howling, supposedly to scare off evil spirits. Then they symbolically chase the carpenter away with plantains and hooting.
Chase him away.
Seems like a ritualized ending. Before purifying the house with cow dung water and boiling milk with rice, a common sign of prosperity.
Okay. And quickly, a few others mentioned.
A Uralis puberty ceremony involving a separate hut, bathing, and symbolically feeding an infant on a pestle. The Uyala, a swing ceremony noted for some marriage contexts, and Vannan funeral pollution needing purification on the 16th day by a Nambi priest.
It's just the sheer density of ritual practice described. It really shows a world where these things weren't separate from life. They were life, marking transitions, enforcing beliefs, keeping social order.
Absolutely, sometimes in ways that feel incredibly distant to us now.
They certainly paint a vivid picture, even if it's sometimes bewildering. Let's shift now to how this volume talks about broader social dynamics, identity, how castes interacted, how they saw themselves.
Okay. We can actually circle back to matu here, that washed cloth for purification. Specifically, the Tiyans custom involving the washerwoman.
Right. She provides the clean cloth, and the person gives their dirty clothes to be washed.
And the source highlights something interesting. The Tiyans theoretically had the power to withhold this matu.
Meaning they could refuse to give the service.
Or refuse to accept it effectively. And by doing so, they could potentially outcast someone. Though the text adds this power was apparently seldom used.
But the source contrasts this with the Valluvans.
Sharply, it says the Valluvans knew nothing of this practice. And the text interprets this difference as a sign of Vallluvan inferiority in the hierarchy of the time.
How so?
The social boundary was clear. Tiyans would eat rice cooked by an Vallluvan, but not the other way around. The matu custom, or lack thereof, reinforced that boundary.
So this seemingly minor ritual exchange actually reveals a lot about perceived purity and how social lines were drawn and maintained.
Exactly. And as we noted, the Velans also gave matu, so it seems to have been a pretty widespread mechanism for marking status and managing interaction.
The source gives other examples of hierarchy, too.
Yes, like a Tiyan eating food prepared by a Mapilla, a Malabar Muslim, who was considered lower status, except for rice, which had stricter purity rules.
And differences in address.
Right. The source reports a clear social gradation observed among Vallamas, Kamas, and Kappas, reflected in how they were addressed. Vallamadora, like Esquire, Kamavaro, like Mr. Seer, and then just plain Kapru.
Those honorifics, or the lack of them, clearly signaled relative status.
Definitely. Then there are the Vellalas, generally described as respectable, mainly agriculturalists, but also in other fields.
Like government service, clerks, merchants.
Yes, noted for specific farming skills. And importantly, the source says they would not do work they considered degrading.
And they had subdivisions.
Acknowledged ones, yes, like Malayaman, Nataman, Sudarman, supposedly from common stock, but didn't always intermarry.
And a really interesting division within them related to diet.
Yes, a vegetarian division that was very strict. They wouldn't eat with non-vegetarians, and crucially wouldn't let their daughters marry them either.
The text calls this hypergamy, right? Marrying only equal or higher status.
Exactly. It's presented as an example of that. The source also mentions their historical role in that Tulafuram weighing ceremony.
And the Kotai Velas.
Known for observing strict Gosha female seclusion, which just highlights the diversity within even one broadcast category. Different groups adapted differently.
And the source includes a very difficult detail about the Velas past.
Yes, it mentions their history as slave owners. Specifically, purchasing and keeping predial slaves people tied to the land from the Palaya caste. It's a stark reminder of the harsh realities of the hierarchy and labor systems documented back then.
Absolutely. Okay, let's look at the Uralis. The source describes them in two different contexts.
It does, as agricultural laborers down in the plains in Madura and Trichinopoly, but also as distinct hill tribes up in the Cardamom Hills.
And both groups claim the same descent.
Both claimed descent from someone called Mutaraja, and both said they used to be watchmen, connecting back to that Talayari role we started with.
The Low Country Uralis had a really remarkable way of getting back into caste if they were excommunicated.
Quite something. The source describes a whole ritual. It involved sacrificing a sheep or goat, marking the person's forehead with its blood, holding a feast, and then, the crucial part, placing some of the feast food on the roof for the crows.
For the crows? Why?
If the crows came down and ate the food, it was taken as a sign of acceptance, like divine or community validation. Only then were they fully back in.
Wow. That's an incredibly specific ritual relying on animal behavior as an omen.
It really is. It shows a belief system where getting back in wasn't just apology, it needed these tangible acts, maybe even supernatural approval.
And the hill tribe Uralis in the Cardamom Hills, equally distinct customs.
Very much so. Their traditional duty was holding ceremonial umbrellas for local chiefs. They moved their homes after cultivating an area, sometimes living rough in caves or under trees while building new huts.
The source mentions unique clothing styles, too.
Yes, specific male and female dress. And very strict rules about pollution, particularly around menstruation and childbirth, with separate huts required.
And their marriage customs.
Also specific, arranged marriages, but with a kind of exchange system. If a man married into a particular family, a girl from his family often had to marry back into the bride's family, maintaining balance, perhaps.
The text also notes they had a good ear for music and sorcery practices.
Yes, called chapuka and chatuka. They believed these were taught to them by their ancestors, who appeared as young women in trances.
Fascinating. And their diet.
Pretty diverse, lots of different animals mentioned, but the source notes a strong aversion to beef, cats, and toads. Very specific dislikes.
Okay. Briefly, the Vitikuvans.
Noted as an agricultural and hunting caste, possibly related to another group, the Vedans, but the Vetivins consider themselves superior, and the source mentions they had a history of military service.
And the most striking detail about them.
Visually, yes. The description of the women's dress, consisting solely of 3 clusters of long leaves hanging from the waist down.
Just leaves. That's incredible.
Yeah.
It immediately sets them apart in the text.
It really does, a very vivid detail.
Finally, the volume touches upon land rights, showing how even something like property was tied up in caste and history. It mentions the Todas.
Yes, their historical prescriptive right to pasture land up on the Nilgiri Hills. It was recognized, to an extent.
Recognized how?
The source notes the government actually paid them compensation hours $150 a month back then for interference with these traditional rights.
And there were restrictions on the land.
Yes. No cultivation allowed except by Todas themselves, no building by outsiders, restrictions on hunting. It even records a petition the Todas made against a government ban on burning grass on the hillsides, which was part of how they managed their pastures.
So a documented conflict between traditional land use and colonial administration.
Exactly. And for the Vellalas, the source includes a story, a legend really, about a Chola Raja and a Naga Kanya, a serpent princess.
And this story was used for what?
Cited to establish or validate the Vassala's claim to land rights. It shows how myths and historical narratives were actively used to back up social and economic claims, like who owned the land.
Wow. Okay, just reflecting on everything we've covered, it's kind of staggering.
It really is. From the Talyaris' duties, the oil pressers' names, the Tandans' authority,
to the different views on the Taliketu, the Tottiyan marriage customs, the Toto funeral buffalo,
the sorcery, the Matu system, the Urali crow ritual, the Vellalas subdivisions, the Vituvan leaf dress, the land rights disputes. It's an immense amount of detail.
And this is just from one volume covering T to Z. The sheer volume and the sheer variety of human customs, social rules, occupations documented here is just huge.
What's really fascinating, I think, is how the specific details, like the compelled cohabitation thing or the crows eating food off the roof, they weren't just weird facts. They paint a picture of entire social logics.
Yeah, they reveal the underlying beliefs, the power structures, the really complex ways communities organized themselves over 100 years ago.
These accounts tell us so much about human adaptability, complexity, and sometimes just the sheer surprising nature of social structures. How identity, order, knowledge, belief were all woven together.
Tied to your job, your family, your community. It describes a world governed by traditions and rules that can seem utterly alien from where we stand today.
So this deep dive, it's taken us through this incredible landscape. Village watchmen, toddy tappers, complex marriages, sacrifices, sorcery, land rights, worship, social control, all based on this one 1909 record.
And these old sources, they're not dry at all when you dig in. They offer this incredibly detailed window into a past that operated under such different rules.
It's a powerful reminder, isn't it, that what we think of as normal is so dependent on our own time and place.
Absolutely.
And maybe that brings us to a final thought for you, the listener, to mull over.
Yeah.
How much of our own lives today, our jobs, our relationships, our beliefs, even the routines, we barely notice how much of that is shaped by customs, structures, histories that are invisible to us right now.
Customs that might look just as complex or arbitrary or just plain surprising to someone looking back at us 100 years from now.
Exactly. Something to think about.